The radio was never supposed to go quiet. In war, silence on the line was not peace. It was not safety. It was not rest. It meant something had failed, or someone had fallen, or a decision had been made that could longer be undone. On the night of February 3rd, 1944, in the mountains north of Cassino, a broken radio should have sealed the fate of an entire platoon. Instead, it became the reason they lived. At that moment, no one knew it. Yet the snow had been falling since dusk, light at first, then heavier, smothering sound and swallowing landmarks. The narrow mule track that served as their supply route had disappeared under white. To the east, German artillery echoed faintly, testing the night to the west. The Allied line waited in silence, and in a shallow depression between two ridges, 28 American infantrymen lay still, surrounded by darkness, distance, and uncertainty. They were part of the U.S. Fifth Army, pushing north through the Italian peninsula. The terrain was their enemy as much as the Germans. Steep slopes, broken villages, and narrow valleys turned every advance into a slow, bleeding climb. Communications were fragile here. A single wire cut, a single radio damaged. A single mistake, that was all it took. Private First Class Daniel Mercer was not supposed to be the one holding their connection to the outside world. He was not an officer, not a signal corps specialist, not trained for improvisation under pressure. He was a replacement rifleman from Ohio, 21 years old, 3 months in Italy, assigned to carry spare batteries and guard the platoon's SCR-300 radio during movement. A task meant for steadier hands, a task meant to remain in the background. But by midnight, the man trained to use that radio was dead. The platoon had been ordered to advance ahead of the main line, probe a suspected German fallback position, and confirm whether the ridge was lightly held or fortified. It was a dangerous assignment, but not unusual. Small units moved forward constantly in Italy, feeling for the enemy in darkness, testing their strength, reporting back. They had made it halfway up the slope when the first mortar landed. The explosion was not close enough to kill, but close enough to scatter them. Snow and earth sprayed into the night. The platoon dropped flat, hearts pounding. Rifles pressed into frozen ground. Another round fell, then another. The Germans were ringing in. Their radio operator, Corporal Stein, had been crouched behind a rock when the third shell landed. Almost directly behind him, the blast slammed him forward. When Mercer reached him, Stein was already gone, his headset twisted, blood soaking into the snow. The radio lay beside him, cracked. Its antenna bent, its casing split, and the line went silent. For the platoon commander, Lieutenant Harris, this was the moment every officer feared. They were now blind and alone. No way to report their position. No way to call for artillery. No way to warn command that German forces were closer than expected. Worse still, the mortar fire suggested something far more dangerous. They had already been seen. Mercer lifted the radio with shaking hands. He had only basic instruction. Turn it on, check the frequency, call for acknowledgement. Simple steps practiced in daylight. In safety under supervision, none of it worked. The power light flickered once and died. The speaker hissed, then went quiet. The antenna connection sparked weakly, then failed. In that moment, the radio became dead weight. A liability, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Harris knelt beside Mercer, his voice low, controlled. Steady despite the danger. Can you make it work? Mercer did not answer immediately. He tried again, adjusted the dial. Pressed the transmit switch, nothing. No, sir, he finally said, it's gone. For several seconds, Harris said nothing. The mortars had stopped, but that was worse. Silence after artillery often meant movement. It meant German infantry adjusting positions, closing in, preparing to finish what the shells had begun. Without communication, the platoon had only two choices: withdraw blindly and risk walking straight into German patrols, or stay in place and hope they had not been fully identified. Both were dangerous, both could end the same way. But Mercer did not put the radio down. Instead, he opened it. The casing cracked further as he forced it apart. Wires hung loose. The battery compartment was fractured. Snow had worked its way inside the internal crystal oscillator. The heart of the set was shattered. No amount of training could fix that. The radio would never transmit again. Yet Mercer kept working. Not because he believed he could repair it, but because he understood something instinctively. A broken tool was still a tool. The SCR-300 was large, heavy, and metallic when powered. It produced faint electromagnetic noise, even when not transmitting. When damaged, those signals became erratic, unpredictable, useless for communication, but not necessarily invisible. Mercer remembered a briefing he had barely listened to weeks earlier. German listening posts used direction-finding equipment to locate Allied radios the enemy hunted signals. They tracked them. They followed them like trails in the snow. Most soldiers feared that Mercer saw possibility in it. If the Germans were listening, then perhaps silence was not safety. But controlled noise could be deception. He carried the broken radio several yards downslope. Away from the platoon's actual position, he found a rock outcrop wedged the set between stones, and connected the remaining battery leads manually. Sparks jumped. The power light glowed faintly. Not enough to transmit a voice, enough to create a signal. Then he left it there. He returned to Harris and whispered what he had done. The lieutenant stared at him, uncertain. "You're saying they might track it?" "Yes, sir, and it's not us, no, sir." For a moment the idea seemed reckless. If Mercer was wrong, it would change nothing. If he was right, it could draw German patrols away from the platoon's true position. It was not a plan taught in manuals. It was not approved by command. It was instinct, desperation, and courage combined. They waited. Minutes passed. Then movement. Shadows shifted along the ridge where the broken radio lay. Faint shapes emerged, low and careful. Weapons ready, the Germans had taken the bait. Mercer watched through the dark. As at least a squad approached the false signal, they were quiet, disciplined, confident. They believed they had found the Allied position. And in that moment, Mercer realized the radio had not failed. It had changed purpose. But how long would the deception last? And what would happen when the Germans discovered the truth? The German patrol moved with the certainty of men who believe. The night belonged to them. Mercer lay on his stomach behind a low ridge, his breath slow, his hands numb from the cold. Through gaps in the falling snow, he watched dark figures converge on the outcrop, where the broken radio now rested. Their shapes were blurred, but their discipline was unmistakable. Rifles held low helmets tilted forward. No wasted motion. They were not rushing. They were hunting. To the platoon, the silence was unbearable. Every second stretched, every rustle of snow could mean discovery. Lieutenant Harris had ordered the men to hold their positions, weapons aimed outward, fingers tight around cold steel triggers. No one spoke. No one moved unless absolutely necessary. They were now spectators to Mercer's gamble. The Germans reached the rock formation and halted. One knelt, brushing snow from the ground. Another leaned forward, studying the faint glow that pulsed. Weakly from the radio's damaged power indicator. It was just visible in darkness, like a dying ember. To trained eyes, it was unmistakable. A signal one of the soldiers gestured sharply. Two more moved around the outcrop, spreading out, securing the area. They believed they had found an Allied listening post or forward observer. If they were correct, this position would normally be guarded. If they found no one, suspicion would rise. And suspicion meant search. Mercer's heart pounded. His idea had worked too well. The deception had succeeded. But only for a moment. The danger had not vanished. It had simply moved. The German patrol leader approached the radio. Carefully he lifted it, turning it over. Examining the cracked casing and bent antenna, he frowned. Something was wrong. The radio was active. But no one was there. No footprints except their own. No discarded equipment. No covering fire. No signs of recent occupation. This was not how Allied units operated. They did not abandon active radios. A soldier knelt and brushed more snow aside. The footprints leading away were faint, partially erased by snowfall, but visible enough they led uphill, away from the outcrop toward Mercer's platoon. The moment of advantage was slipping. Harris sensed the change even before Mercer whispered the warning. German voices had shifted in tone sharper. Faster, the careful patience of discovery had become suspicion. "Prepare to move," Harris murmured, slow and silent. The platoon could not stay. The Germans would soon widen their search. If they remained, the deception would collapse into disaster. But they still had one asset. Time. The broken radio had bought them minutes. Perhaps only a few, but in combat, minutes were sometimes the difference. Between withdrawal and annihilation, Mercer had another idea. He did not ask permission. He crawled backward away from the platoon, circling wide, using the terrain to remain hidden. His goal was not the Germans, it was the radio. He knew if the enemy realized the signal was a trap, they would destroy it and resume searching. But if the radio could be moved again, if the signal could shift, then the illusion of a moving Allied unit might be created, not a stationary position. A retreating one, he reached the outcrop from a different angle, staying low, sliding over rock and snow. The Germans were now 15 to 20 meters uphill. Scanning for signs of life, their attention was forward. Mercer seized the radio. It was heavier than before, damp with snow, the casing colder than iron. The battery wire sparked again as he shifted his grip. The faint glow remained. He dragged it down slope, not far, just enough to change the direction of the signal. Then he hid it in a shallow ravine, where the terrain would amplify its electromagnetic distortion. The broken internals caused irregular emissions, the kind that could confuse direction. Finding equipment to a German listening post. The signal would now appear to move. He withdrew, heart racing. Moments later, German voices echoed again, confusion. Orders exchanged. One soldier pointed downhill. Another shook his head, pointing back toward the ridge. The radio no longer aligned with their expectations. They believed the Allied unit was retreating, and so they followed. The patrol split into two elements. One moved cautiously downslope toward the new signal source. The other remained behind, scanning uphill. That division was everything. It weakened their search. It slowed their momentum. It fractured their certainty. Harris seized the opportunity. With slow, deliberate gestures, he directed his men to withdraw laterally across the slope. Rather than directly backward, they moved in single file, each man stepping exactly where the previous had stepped, minimizing tracks, erasing evidence, as snow continued to fall. The broken radio continued to whisper its falsehood into the night. To German ears, it suggested a retreating Allied element, disorganized but alive, a target worth pursuing. To Mercer and his platoon, it was now a shield. For nearly 40 minutes, the deception held. German patrols followed the moving signal downhill, then farther into broken terrain, where movement became slower and less predictable. They encountered no enemy, only snow rock and confusion. By the time doubt finally took hold, the platoon was gone. They had withdrawn to a fallback position behind a natural ridge, linking up with another Allied unit. Only then did Harris allow the men to breathe freely. Mercer sat against a tree, exhausted, shaking. His uniform soaked, his hands burned slightly from exposed wiring. He had not fired a shot. He had not charged an enemy. He had not been trained for any of this. Yet 28 men were alive because of him. No official report would ever capture it fully. No citation could explain the instinct behind it. No doctrine described how broken equipment could become a weapon. The radio was eventually destroyed by German troops, crushed and discarded when its deception was discovered, but by then its purpose had been fulfilled. It had not transmitted voices, it had transmitted doubt, and doubt in war was often more powerful than bullets. But one question remained, even as Mercer's unit settled back into the line. By dawn, the snow had eased, leaving the mountains unnaturally clear. The air was sharp, every breath visible. From their new position behind the ridge, Mercer's platoon could see faint movement in the valleys below. German patrols were still searching, but now, with hesitation, their confidence from the night before had been replaced with uncertainty. That alone was a victory in warfare. Confusion was not a small thing. It disrupted planning, it slowed reaction. It planted the fear that what had once been reliable could no longer be trusted. And the Germans, who relied heavily on signal interception and direction-finding equipment, did not tolerate uncertainty in their systems. Word of the incident traveled quickly. Through German intelligence channels, a forward listening post had reported a mobile Allied transmission that vanished without engagement. Patrols had followed it and found nothing. The radio signal behaved incorrectly. It shifted without pattern. It weakened and strengthened unpredictably to train technicians. This suggested either faulty Allied equipment or intentional deception. Both possibilities were dangerous. Within hours, German signal officers began reviewing their assumptions. They had built much of their night reconnaissance. Around radio interception, it was a powerful advantage. Allied units were dependent on wireless communication. In the mountainous Italian terrain, by tracking these signals, German forces could locate forward observers, artillery coordinators, and isolated platoons. But Mercer's broken radio had introduced a new variable. If a damaged set could imitate movement, if a false signal could draw patrols away, then every intercepted transmission became suspect. What had once been a certainty became a risk. German commanders were cautious men. They preferred known systems to improvisation. When doubt appeared, they did not ignore it. They adapted. By mid-morning, German patrol procedures began to change. Signals were no longer followed blindly. Ground confirmation became mandatory. Patrols were ordered to verify radio intercepts visually. Before committing forces, this slowed their reaction time. It also saved Allied lives. For Mercer's platoon, the consequences were immediate. Their earlier mission to probe the ridge and assess German strength was now irrelevant. They had accidentally accomplished something far more valuable. They had disrupted the enemy's intelligence rhythm. But there was danger in this success. If the Germans truly understood what had happened, they might attempt the same deception themselves. The concept was simple. Create a false signal, draw the enemy, strike from elsewhere. It was a tactic that could be turned in either direction. Lieutenant Harris recognized the risk. When they reported back to battalion headquarters, he emphasized the unusual behavior of the radio, the false signal movement. And Mercer's actions, signal officers listened closely. Some were skeptical. Others immediately grasped the implications. A broken radio had become a strategic lesson. That afternoon, orders were issued quietly across several units. Damaged radios were no longer to be discarded immediately. Their electromagnetic emissions were to be studied. Signal crews were instructed to document irregularities. The idea of controlled signal deception entered Allied thinking, not as a formal tactic but as a possibility. Mercer had unknowingly opened the door, yet he felt no triumph. He felt dread, because he understood something the officers did not yet fully grasp. Deception required control, and broken equipment was by nature unpredictable. It could save lives once it could cost them, later that night. As Mercer cleaned his rifle and tried to steady his hands, German artillery opened fire again along distant ridges. The front had not changed. The war had not paused to reflect on innovation. It moved forward relentlessly. And somewhere on the opposite side of the lines, German signal officers were experimenting. Captured Allied radios were tested. Damaged components were studied. Engineers examined how faults affected frequency stability. They recreated erratic emissions. They measured how direction-finding equipment reacted. Within days, they understood a damaged transmitter could simulate movement. It could suggest retreat. It could suggest confusion. It could suggest opportunity. An opportunity was a trap. Both sides were eager to set. The Italian front was already a battlefield of shadows. Narrow valleys ruined villages. Steep ridges and constant fog created perfect conditions for deception. Now, the invisible layer of radio warfare was becoming just as dangerous. For Mercer's platoon, the danger returned sooner than expected. 3 nights later, during another forward patrol, they detected a faint signal moving along a valley floor to their west. It was not strong enough to carry voice transmission. Only interference, only a pulse. The same kind of pulse Mercer had created. Their signal officer frowned. "That's not clean," he said quietly. "That's not a proper set." Harris felt a chill. They had not reported any damaged Allied radios missing. No friendly units were operating in that sector. The signal was inconsistent, shifting, almost teasing. It was familiar. Too familiar. The Germans had learned. The platoon halted immediately. Instead of following the signal, they marked its position and withdrew. Minutes later, German flares rose in the valley. Machine gun fire erupted where the signal had been. A trap had been laid, not for them, but for anyone reckless enough to trust what their equipment told them. Mercer understood the weight of it. His idea had saved lives, but now it had changed the battlefield. He had altered how the enemy thought. In war, innovation was never owned by one side for long. What had begun as desperation had become doctrine. And doctrine, once shared by both sides, became deadly as the Italian campaign dragged on. Radio deception quietly entered a new phase. Signals were no longer treated as truth. They were treated as possibilities, as lures, as threats. Mercer would never receive official recognition for this. His action was too small, too improvised, too difficult to document, but its echo was present. Every time a patrol hesitated before following a signal, every time a commander questioned a transmission, every time silence was chosen over response, the broken radio had changed how men listened to the war. Yet one danger remained unresolved, hanging over Mercer and every soldier who depended on invisible.